Hi, folks. I was just saying, as people are coming in, I am in Tobermory, so I just don't have my camera on because it was lagging. But glad to see everyone here tonight. And we are joined by Paul from the city, who is going to be talking about a very important topic for city building, which is development charges. And it is very topical right now because they are going through a master study, which happens every 5 years. I'm sure he will explain that better. But I'm just going to pull up my agenda, make sure you got everything. Yes, so the topic tonight is development charges funding our growing city. And Paul, I was actually wondering, are you okay if people, since we have a smaller group, if people just like pop in and ask questions as you go along? Sure. Sometimes, yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, that's not a problem. We'll keep it informal and
perfect. Because I find sometimes it can be, if you're trying to hold on your question till the very end, sometimes it can be hard to remember what you're going to ask. So folks, feel free to either put some questions in the chat or turn on your cameras and your audio and just pop your questions to Paul. Like I said, this is a very important topic, and the Urban League has been following it, especially Sandy Levin, who's here tonight, and then Alistair Beaton have been sitting on the DC calls and keeping us up to date as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Paul to get started and maybe share some slides.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Skylar. I'll get things up here then for everyone. Just if I get a thumbs up from someone when you can see it, that would be great.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, and let me see if I can get out of the okay, this will be fine then. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to speak to the League membership tonight. I really want to as well express our great appreciation and support for the League's involvement in our DC External Committee, as was just mentioned a few months ago by Skylar. Sandy and Alistair have been fantastic members of our committee. They've been involved for the last 3 studies now, actually, if you count this one. So it's been great to have their involvement and participation. There's a lot of technical matters that we deal with, a lot of important policy matters affecting our city and growth. And so it's really important that the League's voice is at the table for those conversations as well. I also want to thank Skylar for hanging out in the gallery as well and attending our meetings too. So it's been great to have you there for that too. So like I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about DC's writ large, but I'm going to talk a little bit about growth management as well in the city and some how we do our infrastructure delivery as well. That's sort of reaching a little bit outside of my portfolio. So I'm the Director of Capital Assets and Projects for the city. So I work for the city treasurer in the finance area, but I work extensively with my colleagues in planning and economic development, and also in environment and infrastructure as well, and various other areas of the city that provide capital infrastructure to support our services. DC's, I've often said, are probably the second most Byzantine area of municipal finance after municipal taxation. So it's great to have everyone here to try to find out a bit more. And thanks very much for taping this. And hopefully others will find some interest in it too. So with my presentation here, I've broken it into basically 3 themes tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about some context first about our growing city and how London's been growing and how it's looking to grow going forward. I will caveat that by saying that a bit of what I'm going to be talking tonight is a little stale because we're going through a growth projections update right now as well. So the 2001 or 21 census information came out, and so we're going to be updating our information based on that as well too. And we've seen some pretty significant changes over the last couple of years in the city as well that I'm sure will really impact those as we go forward. I'll then get into the DC piece about actually how we fund growth infrastructure in the city and how we do that writ large in the province as well. And then I'll wrap up with a bit on infrastructure planning as well, sort of when we finish the high level decision making, how the rubber hits the road with everything that we provide out to support towers, businesses, subdivisions, all the good things that are part of our city. So if we start with our growing city, we always start off when we do our growth projections and we look at the city's growth with our employment forecast, because really it's one of the key drivers of population growth in the city. It's what tends to drive migration in the province. So both international migration, people coming in from other countries, in migration. So that's interprovincial that we have, people coming from other provinces, and of course, intra-migration, which is people coming, which is a big part of London's growth as well, from other geographic areas around us too. London is the regional growth center, as we know, for our region. So we do have a lot of people coming to London for employment prospects, and then they call our community home as well. So what you have here is an illustration of our employment sectors over the past 20 years, and then looking into the future as well. This is from our last growth projection that was put together in 2018, I believe it was. And so what I've got highlighted here in the box in orange is our most recent one, which is the mid-2021 period. From there, we look at going forward forecasting to inform our needs that we have. I think a few things I'll illustrate here. One is that London's really fortunate to have a very balanced economy amongst our various sectors. We are very fortunate in that regard in relation to a lot of other major communities as well that may have sort of specific economic drivers. London's always been very well rounded in its commercial and office sector, industrial and institutional sectors as well. And what you're seeing as well too is that the shares between the various employment categories are fairly consistent over time as well too. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any changes with that based on the census information, the projection methodology that we have. But I think probably going to be seeing something fairly similar going forward. The two caveats related to that, though, would be what will happen with commercial and office development going forward. So that will be an interesting thing to follow and an interesting flow through for our growth projections going forward. And then you can see the little yellow bar at the bottom here, that's work from home. So people that are working from home in various capacities. It'll be interesting as well to see how that changes over time as well too now, obviously with the changes with COVID, but also how that changes in relation to the other sectors too, and whether we compartmentalize that out based on people that are working home that are in office and retail and institutional environments, or people that are just working from home that they have their own business or things like that. So it'll be fairly interesting to observe going forward. The next slide here is then when we have our employment projections and we start drilling into how does that then impact our population forecast going forward too. And in London, over the past two projections now, we've actually done growth scenarios to help inform what kind of high and low and midpoint scenarios we might be looking at for population growth. For our DC purposes and our planning purposes, and in general, we tend to use what's called the reference population scenario. So that's the midpoint one. What we had anticipated based on the 2018 numbers was a 2021 population of 418,800. Our actual population ended up being 424,000, which is the first time in probably 15, 20 years that we've actually had higher than expected growth. Usually we're pretty optimistic, I'll say, in our growth projections in a reasonable way. But this time we actually have seen higher than expected population. We are expecting just under a 1% population growth. We ended up at 2%, which is pretty interesting to see. So we'll be interested to see then how that translates into these projections going forward, because the population is what drives the next slide I've got here, which is then how does that population get manifested and served by the different housing forms that we have throughout our community. What you can see with this bar here, this is the 2016 to 2021 period. So the period that was part of the last projection that we had. We were anticipating a bit of a return to some of the older days in a way where 50% roughly of our growth was going to be coming from single family homes, 22% from townhouses, and 30% from apartments in various forms as well. That's been a really interesting thing to follow over the past 3 to 5 years, because we've essentially seen an inverse of the low density share and the high density share. So we've been looking at 50 to 60% of our total units being in high density forms. So the various apartments that you're seeing throughout the city, there's lots of cranes in the skies, I think everyone can appreciate. And we haven't seen as much low-rise, low-density development as well. Some would argue that's a bit of a supply issue that we've been working our way through over the past few years, but I think there's a bit of a structural issue here too that we're catching and picking up on as well, especially when you'd looked at the 2011 to 2016 period, where we were seeing something like that. Starting at that point, we didn't know if it was a trend yet or just an observation at the time. So going forward, I really do think that we are going to be seeing lots more medium family, multifamily construction in the city. We've also been seeing a very much a strengthening interest in our stylish neighborhoods. So we're seeing obviously a lot of intensification projects that are coming forward. Our official plan policies are helping to drive that, but I think there's also a really strong demographic aspect of that and economic aspect of that too, where people want to be in diverse, walkable communities going forward as well too. So lots of good opportunities there. Some growing pains associated with that, of course, on the development side, but something we're working together on as a community. This is hopefully you're probably familiar with this. This is
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
Could I just, Sandra's just wondering, what is the forecast housing structure based on?
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that, Sandra. I haven't got the chat.
No, it's all good. If I
The
see questions, I'll ask them.
Oh, okay, so that's a really good question, Sandra. I appreciate that. So when our consultants do their technical modeling for this, they're looking at population, and then they're looking at of that population, what is the household for that population that's going to manifest in, and then what's called in the industry the propensity for development type. So over time, they've done a lot of surveys and information's been gathered about housing preferences for different households, and that information is looked at to determine whether there's a reasonable amount of change that will be occurring to that based on either demographics, generational changes, anything related to our land supply as well, because that can inform it as well too. What we've seen historically, though, is a fairly consistent pattern in London of our household propensities, but we are thinking that is starting to change significantly as well, which is what you're seeing reflected in the share captures here as well too. So hopefully I answered that. I'll go back to the chat here and let me see if there's any follow-up.
Well, Paul, I'm not chatting, but I have one more question. It's Norman here. So I'm looking at the change from the, if you will, single-family household to high density. So the question really is, at this point in time, where's the high density happening? Because there's a lot of building going on in the burbs.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is that, you know, we talk about inward and upward, and I'm just wondering, is it really happening right now?
So that's a great question as well. Thank you. And I'm going to see here. I think I've got it. Norman, I've got another thing. Perfect. This worked out really well. Okay, so planning, or my colleagues in planning and economic development do a really interesting thing called the annual development report every year. And so it really looks at building construction and where that's actually occurring as well. That report, just for everyone's interest and benefit, came out on February the 7th of this year for last year's year-end numbers. It's a really good read, and I'd recommend you take a look at it as well. But what it does provide as well is information on where is that growth manifesting. So to your point, or to your question here, Norman, so you can see where the HDR units have been located in 2021 in particular. So we are seeing obviously quite a bit in the core of the city, but we are seeing quite a bit on the periphery as well. And this is something we had anticipated was going to occur because we have a number of designated and zoned sites that are in older subdivisions for high density residential. I'll put on a planner. I am a planner, but I'm not the planner, but I'll put on a planning hat for a minute and state that with the London plan, we really shifted from a growth model where we had complete communities that were located throughout the city to more of an urban structure form where we're trying to centralize growth around certain nodes and corridors. So we tried to reallocate as much of that growth as we could, but there's a lot of legacy opportunities throughout the city as well. So that's why you're seeing a fair bit of suburban high density construction too. I will also say there is a fairly strong market demand for that as well, that the developers are looking to capture.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else before I move on from that?
I think Dan might have a question. Dan, I'm not sure how to interpret it, so I don't know if you want to come off mute and maybe ask it.
Do as soon as I can get into a video mode here. On the strengthening interest in established neighborhoods.
Yes.
How did you source that information? How were you able to determine that's one of the trends that's occurring? Where did that? How did you get that? How did you come to that conclusion?
So that's a great question. We are seeing information coming from the census with changes of housing formation. So you're seeing in older subdivisions now, or sorry, not older subdivisions, older older areas, I guess I'll say, of the city, the housing number of people that live in a unit is actually starting to increase, which is something we haven't seen in a long time. So usually the natural progression of an area is that you have a new development area that tends to be a very high persons per unit levels, because there tends to have a lot of families in them. And then from there, over time, people grow out, the subdivision ages, and the people age with the subdivision as well, or the growth area. So we are starting to see some information in the census now that's related to that. We're also seeing a lot of the applications that are coming in for intensification as well too, which demonstrates a market interest in it as well. Not just the planning permissions, because the planning permissions don't actually force development to occur. It does sort of support the context for development to occur, but then the development community responds to opportunities and interest.
All right, thank you.
We also, I should also say too, we do get a lot of anecdotal feedback from the various people in the community that we speak to in a lot of different sectors, but that's sort of hard to quantify as well too, but that does support, when you start triangulating different sources, you start coming to some of those conclusions. So yeah, I think this is my last slide for this section. I just want to emphasize the importance of the London Plan, obviously, as a growth plan as well in our community. So the London Plan is informed by the growth projections that are put forward, because that's sort of the basis for how we then determine how much land we're going to have throughout the city and how much we're going to allocate. But also then the London Plan flows through into the projections as well, based on the available permissions that we have. And so over time, it's sort of this give and take that goes on with your planning construct as well too, which is an interesting part of how growth and development occurs. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to shift into the next section on DC's core and how we fund our growth in the city. So just in general, when you ask the question about what are DCs, they are a fee that's charged to all new development in the city. So anytime someone builds an apartment, builds a square meter of commercial space, builds a warehouse, a factory, any sort of houses as well, everyone's making a contribution to the infrastructure that's required to support that development as well. And DCs are paying for the major citywide infrastructure that we have to, and I'll give a bit more information and examples on that as well. It's also important to recognize that development charges are heavily regulated under the Development Charges Act, which is a provincial piece of legislation that specifies how and what rules municipalities have to put out when they determine their development charges on 5-year increments. So there's some other touching on. So I'm just looking at the chat here. My apologies. Actually, Skylar, could I ask you to moderate the chat a little bit for me, in that way?
Sure. Yeah. It just came in like a moment ago. So
okay.
You do want to answer it now from Sandra?
Maybe I'll wait till a little bit further, because I think it was more related to the previous section. So
okay.
Okay. Okay, so development charges are really key for building new infrastructure in our city to support growth. We also collect DCs to pay down debt for past investments as well too. So you probably can appreciate that when major development areas go in the city, we have to make big investments up front to actually accommodate that growth that's going to occur. And so we incur debt with that we pay back over time, as DCs are generally a 20-year recovery period that we're looking at. And then finally, and significantly, and especially for this group, DCs are trying to make sure that taxpayers are not paying for costs that support growth. And I'll be speaking more about that too, because that's an important part of the DC regime. How do we use DCs is an important thing that comes up. And I think this is an important slide to clarify how the city does use DC dollars and what we do. So as I mentioned, we're using it to fund growth-related capital infrastructure. It has to be related to growth as well. We also do use DC funding to provide some cost sharing as well to developers for infrastructure that benefits areas beyond their subject development. And I'll speak a bit more about that in a few moments as well too. But importantly, DCs just aren't a general revenue tool that we collect for. There are limitations. We can't use DCs to pay for operating costs. So for example, DCs will pay for the cost of a library and community center, but we can't then use DCs to pay for the ongoing costs associated with the staffing and things like that. We can't use DCs for life cycle renewal. So once life cycle reaches the end of its useful life, then that's when other sources of funding kick in to pay for that. So DCs are just paying for the upfront costs associated with it. DCs as well generally can't pay for service improvement as well too. So if we aren't improving our standard or actually changing our standard, and we're just doing something different, then there are some restrictions on that as well that it's important to recognize. We also can't use DCs to pay for the portion of capital projects that benefit the existing community. So in the DC world, you often hear the distinction between the growth share and the non-growth share. So some projects will that are going into new areas will still provide some benefit to what's existing in that community. So we recognize a portion of that project cost, and that's paid by either tax sources or water and sewer rates. And then finally, we do make a differentiation between what's major infrastructure in the city, what the city does pay for through DCs, and then what's local infrastructure. So that's directly provided by developers and paid for eventually by the people that buy houses in those new communities, or the businesses that go in there as well too. So DCs, as I mentioned, are governed by the Development Charges Act. It is special regulated funding, and it does have a lot of clear requirements that are associated with it. The Act does state that municipalities may levy DCs, so they're not a required thing that you have to do. For example, the City of St. Catharines doesn't actually have DCs, which is kind of surprising because they're in the growth plan, but their council has opted not to collect DCs. Instead, they pay for growth costs through the tax base. Middlesex County as well doesn't have a DC. So if looking at a more localized context, their individual communities do though. You have to actually do a development charges background study to establish your charges, and I'll talk more about what's related to that, but there's clear rules that are related to that as well. Your bylaw has to identify the charges and how they're applied to the various forms of development. It's really important that your DC study and bylaw adoption has a public process. According to the DC Act, that only involves one public meeting at council, but in London, we do a lot more public engagement because we think it's really important to get community feedback in setting our DC rates as well. So we have the DC External Committee that we have, and then we do other things like this and other workshops to try to collect feedback as well. Importantly, the background study and the bylaw are appealable to what's now the Ontario Lands Tribunal. I should correct the slide here. So that's an important thing to recognize, that whatever we do has to be defensible on appeal as well. And interestingly, when DCs are appealed, the board can either maintain the charge that's calculated or they can lower it. So you can't actually have an appeal that says, well, municipality, you actually are under collecting for DCs and you should be doing more for growth costs. The charge should actually be higher. So the Act doesn't actually allow for that. So it's an important thing to remember. DCs also go into separate reserve funds that only can be used for growth purposes, and I'll talk more about those in a few moments as well. And the city treasurer every year, and this is going to be coming out in another month, publishes a report about how DC funds are spent as well, for really strong public transparency as well too about collected DCs.
Paul?
Yes.
Could I ask one? I think it's specific to this slide deck. So it's from Sandra. So how is decades-long ongoing maintenance calculated into DCs? Seems it is not, and why not? So it sounds like, yeah, you said like decades-long maintenance costs are not in DCs. So could you just explain why not?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Sandra. So ongoing maintenance costs for existing infrastructure we can't collect for. However, if there is a facility, for example, let's say there's a pumping station that we've had for a long time that it's been operating, we now believe through the servicing studies that we've done and the engineering assessments can actually accommodate additional flows from new growth areas. The enhancements that would be made to that pumping station would be collected through DCs. That doesn't happen very often, but generally things that occur over time are paid for through things like assessment growth funding. So we're taking money every year for new communities that are built to try to pay for some of those ongoing costs, or it's part of the tax base that we have for life cycle infrastructure renewal. So
can I also ask another question?
Yeah.
So like, for example, just maybe a specific one, like if there's a library in the Northwest End and then a developer puts in 300 new homes near the library, would there be like, you know, the library might have to buy 1,000 more books to service those 300 new people? Is that a DC or is that operating?
So that would be DC. Is the books are actually deemed to be capital costs. So the books, the library over time is looking to at its digital infrastructure too. And so if it was making major digital investments that have a fairly lengthy useful life, then we can collect for those as well too. So libraries and community centers, though, I will say tend to lag development quite a bit. And I'll talk about that in a moment here as well too. But yeah, those costs are factored in.
And then one last one while we're on topic.
Yeah.
Was ongoing maintenance ever included in DCs?
To my knowledge, it never has been. DCs have gone through a fairly long evolution. The Development Charges Act, that is sort of the governing legislation now, was first introduced in 1988, and had a pretty significant change in 97. But to my knowledge, they've always dealt with capital costs, and it's always been about historically, like going back to the 60s when we had lot levies, it was about paying for the upfront infrastructure costs associated with new development, not the ongoing costs.
Okay, thanks. I think that's it for this segment.
Okay. So the next thing I have here, and thanks to great questions, everyone. I really appreciate the interest and the request for elaboration. What I've got here is a graphic illustration about a new development area to sort of help piece some of this together and about who's paying for what too in our new communities. So if with this hypothetical scenario, we'll start, we have an existing arterial road, an existing 2-lane rural road as well in a growth area that's never been developed before. The first things that generally happen are that we come in and install trunk services. So this would be your water mains, your trunk sanitary sewers, potentially your storm sewers as well too, depending on the timing of the construction of the stormwater management facility, which is another major cost that we have. I will say as well, though, we are moving towards low impact development infrastructure, which is something maybe at the end we could talk a little bit more about if you've got some questions there. But the storm servicing is an important part of it as well. And once that's in, then that's when the developer really will get going with their infrastructure they're putting in as well. So this is everything that's internal to a subdivision. You have your local roads, you have your local sanitary, water mains, and all of the linear infrastructure that goes in. And so part of that is shared if it benefits development beyond that subdivision. For example, we do some cost sharing as well there. Over time, as the community then builds out, that's when we'll introduce something like a district park in the area to start meeting the growth need. This road may need to be upgraded, so we may do a roads project at that point. And then, for example, the broader community is getting built out, and we'll put in the recreation center at that time as well too. So what you can see here is everything that is in blue is what the city provides in terms of infrastructure that's funded through DCs. Everything that's in yellow is the local, what we term local services. So those are the direct developer costs. And then things that are in green are what's cost shared by the municipality and the developer. So to get here and determine what we need, we go through a development charges background study every 5 years, according to the Development Charges Act. It starts off with a number of policy decisions that are made. That then flows into the background study that we put together. And finally, we get to the rate calculations, which are the outcomes of the entire process. And all of this involves extensive stakeholder engagement throughout the entire piece to make sure that we're factoring in feedback that everyone may have throughout the process as much as we can, we think is reasonably appropriate. So if we start with policy decisions, there's a lot of key individuals and groups that are involved in the policy portion of our DC study. You can see them illustrated there. But this is when we get into some really interesting specific topical questions. We ask council to endorse our list of topics every DC study. And what you've got here is what they've endorsed for the 2025 DC study. So we're looking at our local service policies to make sure they're current. So what's provided by the developers directly versus what's funded through DCs. We just completed our area rating review. So that's looking at whether or not there's a case for certain geographic areas, the city to be paying certain DCs in relation to others, differential development charges. We also are looking at built area servicing requirements and our cost sharing allocations associated with that. Council's also endorsed the review of 3 different DC rate components for consideration as part of the 2025 DC study. One of them is for housing, the others for emergency preparedness, and the third is for water supply as well. We also have a comprehensive review that we're doing with this DC study of our growth and non-growth split. So what share should be provided by people that are moving into new communities versus what's the share that should be provided by the existing tax base or existing ratepayers. And then finally, we're doing some technical refinements to our DC rate models to ensure that we're as current and accurate with our calculations as possible.
Paul, quick question. Is the new climate emergency screening tool being applied to determine area rating?
Great question. So for area rating, it wasn't explicitly utilized for it because area rating was more about cost allocations and the provision of infrastructure. The way climate change informs the DC study is through the various master plans that are done and the various growth planning that's done too. So the climate change lens will inform any of the growth scenarios and growth policies that council has going forward. And from there, it will flow into the DC review and any changes that might be required as part of that. So it was considered indirectly, but not explicitly, as I said. Okay. From policy decisions, we then go into the background study itself, which again involves a lot of really key constructive participants that are providing their voices as well. And at this stage, we actually then get into the technical matters of looking at our growth forecasts and allocations, the capital needs that are required and their timing, any deductions that are required to getting to how much we're recovering as well. Our allocation of benefits, so who should be paying in relation to the various residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial sectors. And then finally, we get to our actual rates, which at a very high level are calculated by taking the total project costs and dividing it by the amount of growth. And that's what you actually, how you derive your DCs. So in terms of deriving our costs and the timing, we start off with citywide growth allocations. So we start with that high level projection that I was talking about at the beginning. And then we actually do a build out scenario for the city where we start refining that down and then allocating that growth to various geographic areas on where we think it's going to occur based on historic trends and things we're observing that are more in real time. That information is then provided to various service areas in the corporation and agency boards and commissions that have DC funded services. They engage a number of consultants to help then determine the capital needs that are associated with that growth. So for example, stormwater is looking at the amount of stormwater management facilities that are required will impact development. Police would be looking at any officer outfitting that's required, vehicles or facilities. So all of that's a lot of modeling work that's done to determine the growth's going to occur in this period. That's going to then trigger the infrastructure, and here's what that's going to cost as well. Those cost estimates are based on past experience. So what we're seeing in terms of tender values or other unit prices, if a consultant's been engaged, for example. We do some municipal benchmarking as well to try to determine how our costs are in relation to others. And then we do include some contingencies as well to make sure that we can absorb cost pressures if they do occur.
Quick question, Paul. So curious as to what groups and organizations are included in the stakeholders list.
Yep, so the stakeholder committee is comprised of the Urban League of London, the London Home Builders Association, the London Development Institute, and the London District Construction Association as well. So those are the groups that have historically participated. The committee is restricted to organized groups in the city as well. So individuals can't join, for example. So we don't have individual developers, for example, that are there. They have to be represented by a group that takes and aggregates the feedback and brings it to the table.
And do you guys do more consultation later on? Like that's like kind of at the very early stage, but then what other consultation do you do?
That's right. So then we do consultation once we actually have the master plans that are completed and once we have our draft rates as well. So if there is anything that's a specific policy matter that would trigger a significant community conversation, we'll do some engagement related to that. However, it's usually once we actually get to the DC rate component when we have sort of something that people can really associate with and tangibly engage with to gain feedback.
Thanks.
So from here, once we've done our rate calculations, we actually get to the end results. And so what you're seeing is an illustration of our 20-year capital plan that we identified at a gross level. So we're looking at spending $2.5 billion on growth-related infrastructure over the next 20 years, which is a number that keeps growing every DC study and not just based on the costs. What you can see then too is we do have required deductions, as I mentioned, that have to be made. So if there are grants that we're anticipating receiving from the federal provincial governments, we take that money off of how much the gross cost is. If there's been any prior funding assigned to the projects, we deduct that as well. Post-period benefit is something that we make an adjustment for with some projects. So if a project is, for example, in year 15 of our forecast, and we anticipate it's actually going to provide benefit beyond the 20-year period, we recognize that there will be some benefit to the people that will be occurring in future years. And then we recover for that through our rate calculations in the future. We have any service standard deductions that might be required for to avoid over collection from the ACT's perspective. And then, as I mentioned, the non-growth allocation here. So how much is borne by the existing ratepayers for that capital plan. What you can see then with this slide is then how that gets split out on the various forms of development that we have. So 70% is paid for by residential development that occurs and people that pay residential DCs. Of the total amount, 1.3 billion of the 2.5 is DC eligible that we have. So you can see the shares for institutional, commercial, and industrial as well. This slide provides then the DC rates that we have for 2022 that are currently in place. I've also provided some examples as well of how much an average form of development might be paying for DC. So for example, with a decent sized apartment building of about 120 units or something like that, they're paying generally about $2 to $3 million in DCs, depending on the unit splits between apartments and 2-bedroom apartments and 1-bedroom apartments or bachelors. Subdivisions, depending on the scale, will pay anywhere between $2 million and $10 million in DCs as well for the infrastructure that is required to support that growth. And then if we had a fairly good sized grocery store that was getting constructed in the city, it'd be paying probably about $3 million in DCs as well too. So it's not small dollars that's involved in development associated with all of these projects. But it is a large amount of investment that we're making that we have to be recovering costs for. And so that's what we're really doing with our DC rates here. So as I mentioned, we do distinguish our DC rates between single and semis. We have a separate rate for townhouses, for apartments that are less than 2 bedrooms, apartments that are greater than 2 bedrooms, commercial development, institutional development, and industrial development. These last two are important to note. One, because the council through its DC bylaw actually has an institutional discount for certain institutional users where they only pay half the institutional rate, and then council and the city pays the other half of their DCs. And then for most industrial development, except certain ones like warehousing and stuff like that, the city actually does pay the full DC amount associated with the industrial growth infrastructure that's occurred too. So we take the amount of square meters that are being constructed times the rate, and that's the amount of the grant that's being provided by the city. So those grants are provided through community improvement plans and community improvement plan grant programs. So they're not part of the DC world, but they're related to DCs. And two other programs that exist, of course, are the residential exemption, residential grant in the downtown, and the Old East Village as well.
We've got two questions.
Yes.
So one is, why is 2 bedrooms more costly? Or sorry, why is 2+ bedroom more costly than 1 or less, I guess?
Yep. So these are great questions. Thank you, everyone. So 2 bedrooms are more because the rates are based on the number of people that are in those units. And so a 2-bedroom residential apartment, I think, has a person's per unit value of 1.98, if I recall correctly. And then for less than 2 bedrooms, it's 1.4. So we actually do make a differentiation that conceptually recognizes that the demand on servicing is probably going to be more from those that are in the 2-bedroom apartment versus the 1-bedroom apartment. That's why you see singles having a higher DC as well too, because their PPUs are around, I think, 3.2 for them as well too.
As a follow-up, following that logic,
Yep.
for like, let's say there's a home that's going to have 2 bedrooms and then a home that's going to have 6.
Yep.
How come there's no differentiation for single family homes?
Yeah, so that's a question we often get quite often, both in terms of the number of bedrooms, the size of the house, the density of the community as well too. Those matters are generally outside of the DC framework that we have to work in. So the province, as I mentioned, has created the DC construct that's been litigated over time to actually identify the categories that you see here. And so to my knowledge, there's not any other communities in the province that operate with any different residential categories, and they don't differentiate between the number of people and the number of buildings that are, oh, sorry, not the number of units, the number of bedrooms and the size of the homes. What you will see in some communities, though, are a combined commercial, institutional, industrial rate. And so that's fairly common. We're fairly unique in having separate ones.
And then to follow up still a little bit more on that, is there an opportunity for the concept of taking away the split of those 2 bedroom, like, you know, the less than 2 over 2? Is that like something that the DC study would look at and address and run some like numbers and some research on?
We've never actually looked at consolidating, collapsing those 2 components. I don't know if there'd be a lot of value in that, though, to be honest. If that's something the league wanted to explore, though, and wanted to suggest, it's something that perhaps we could consider. It's not part of the policy areas that we've got endorsed for this study, so it might be something we look at for the next study going forward. One thing I will mention, though, is that various provincial governments are always very interested in DCs and our DC structure in the province. And so there's often changes to the DC Act that do occur. So if you're interested in getting more involved in DCs at a more macro level, it's probably good to get involved with some community organizations that might be looking at lobbying the province for certain ways of how to structure this and how to not structure it, because I know there are a lot of different perspectives out there.
Cool. And then Bob asked a question, but I don't think Bob, okay, I'm gonna read Bob's question, but I don't think that the numbers are for entire subdivision. So Bob asked, seems odd that a single apartment building would have the same DC as an entire subdivision when an entire subdivision require more capital infrastructure. Paul, I'll let you answer, but my assumption is like the single, that's for like a single lot. That's not for a subdivision.
So that's for like the 2 million would be a fairly small subdivision. So in London, we're kind of unique. If you look at a lot of larger like larger urban centers, you don't see sort of 25, 10 lot subdivisions like you do here, where you have smaller builders and developers. So what we're seeing, though, is more of the $8 to $10 million for sure for the DCs that are paid in those areas.
Okay, one of my last questions, sorry, this is such an interesting slide, Paul. The industrial development subsidy, or I don't know, incentive that you call it, how much revenue is that a year? That is like, or how much does the city give in that subsidy amount to industry?
So that's a good question, Skylar, and it's one that I might be quoting old numbers because it's been quite a while since I've been involved in that, but I believe council makes about a $2 million annual contribution to that. Actually, someone on the line that might have the knowledge on that better than I would is Sandy, because I know he's been following this quite a bit over time. But we do have council does have an annual budget contribution that they make to the reserve fund that supports that. And it's based on an average. So it's trying to determine how much we think we're going to be spending, or sorry, required to be funding. But the actual spending in the reserve fund really fluctuates. Because if I can pull up the annual development report for a minute, that would actually help answer this as well too.
Cool.
So I can't give you the actual dollar amounts, my apologies. But what you can see here, for example, in 2019, we had a huge spike in the actual amount of industrial growth that we had. I believe a large portion of this was for the Maple Leaf plant that was constructed. And so as a result, you see like the year before we had a fairly small amount. So the cash flowing of that reserve fund can really vary. And we want to make sure that we're preparing for these years. And so certain years it might be lower than others, for example.
And just because I was following it, but is that 100% of all development charges for industry are waived, or is that like case by case and they have to apply?
So it is an automatic, depending on the user, because the CIP program does differentiate between targeted and non-targeted uses. So for example, a manufacturing plant would be a targeted use. And so when they come to the counter and their DCs are calculated, then we actually have a form that they sign to accept a grant. And that's when we do a transfer that goes in. So it's one of the economic development measures that we've taken in the city to try to provide the grant right at the same time of when the DCs are identified for that use.
All right, thank you. I also know, Sandy, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'll get that number for you shortly.
Okay, thanks, Sandy.
Okay.
Working as a team, thank you. Okay, if there are any other questions related to this, you can always come back to. So
there are some questions, but I think you might answer them by the end, but I'm keeping track of the ones we're not asking, and we can ask them at the end.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. So once people pay those DCs for their different types of and forms of development, that money then goes into separate reserve funds. So you can see here, like we have one holistic dollar amount that they're paying, for example, per single family home. We then subdivide that up based on the proportion of the DC rate component for that $38,000 that's required for roads, for sanitary. No, that's stormwater. Sorry, that's storm. Anyway, forgive me, I can't recall the graphics here. But anyway, each of the service components that we're collecting for the wave infrastructure for have separate reserve funds that have to be managed separately. And so it's important to know that, for example, something that often comes up is if city council decides not to do a project, can they then take that money that's been collected and then reassign it for other things? And unfortunately, the answer is no, they can't. So the money that's collected has to go towards supporting the servicing that's required for that component. So roads has to pay for roads and things like that. So if we get to the end and we have additional money, then that gets looped into the rate calculation updates that we have going forward. So whether the reserve fund balances are lower and higher can affect the rates.
I've got the number, Paul.
Lovely.
It's the total is $6.1 million a year that's budgeted.
Okay.
1,500 for the residential, 2,400 for institutional, and 2,200 for industrial. Or 2.2 million for industrial, 2.4 million institutional, 1.5 million residential.
Gotcha. Okay, so 6 in total. Great, thank you for that.
And the residential ones, they're just in the community improvement plan areas?
Yeah, just for the downtown Yule's Village.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Paul, while you have it's Norman again, while you have all the little buckets out there, my question would be, did those buckets get reprioritized? And if so, how do they? In other words, would there be a priority towards, for example, green space versus, I don't even know what the logos are either, but is there, or is it, obviously it's not all equal into each bucket. So one would assume that for example, police services might get a fair share of a bucket, but is there a regular reprioritization of those buckets? Yeah,
so that's great as well too, because when you see the $38,000 number, that's a calculated number. So it's not a, we're going to calculate 38 million, or we're going to take $38,000 from a single family home, and then we're going to deposit it in the buckets proportionally. We actually determine the needs for the various services that then roll up to inform how much that's going to be. So each of the buckets have individual master plans associated with them that have identified the required infrastructure and the timing for it. So they all run separately and in parallel based on their various needs, but we do stitch it together with something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes as well too, when we do our infrastructure planning.
Okay.
Can I use one specific example to ask a question?
Yeah.
The Wonderland Road.
Yep.
So that got canceled. That probably had been collecting DCs to expand.
Yes.
Can the money then go, so it's in the transit bucket, can it go towards public transit and cycling?
So it could potentially go towards cycling. So let me back up. So when council determined that they weren't going to proceed with the project. We still have that project identified in the current transportation master plan. So the project was identified based on an engineering derived need for servicing for growth in the city. So what we have to do in the future, and that's what's part of the mobility master plan that hopefully we've all seen launched, is we're actually going to be reevaluating our infrastructure needs and the standards that we have for servicing growth from a transportation and mobility perspective as well. So based on how the outcomes of the transportation master plan, the mobility master plan go, that will determine then the standards that we're applying for when we determine new capital needs. So right now, the money that's been collected hasn't gone into a separate project account, for example. It's all sitting in the general City Services Reserve Fund roads account. And so we're anticipating that that money will still need to be funding other related growth needs. So whether it's something like, and I don't want to presume the outcomes, but if it's high occupancy vehicle lanes, if it is enhanced active transportation and things like that, then that would be eligible in that component. Transit, though, does have a separate component, and the province has, through the changes in the DC Act over time especially, really made sure that we are making a distinction between the different roads costs and the transit costs, because transit has historically been considered to be a soft services in the DC world versus the hard engineering services.
Okay, thanks.
So when we do our DC study, we do have a lot of challenges that are involved in it, where council's really trying to do a significant balancing act when they're putting it together. So they are trying to provide lots of opportunities for growth in the city to accommodate the population employment growth that we're anticipated to experience. They're trying to as well minimize costs to home buyers as well too, to make sure that things are affordable and reasonable in terms of municipal costs for new development. We want to make sure, obviously, that we're collecting enough money to recover for our capital plan and paying for the infrastructure that's needed to support growth. And fundamentally, which is an official plan principle, that growth is paying for growth in the work that we do. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that we're tight and accurate on our determination of growth and non-growth shares. So the last slide in this section is sort of a what if slide. If we didn't actually have DCs, what would we be looking at in our community? And this is my opinion based on what I would anticipate would happen. You would have higher taxes and higher water and sewer rates because you'd be absorbing the growth costs through that. So you wouldn't be actually having a situation where the people that are paying for the infrastructure, they're benefiting from the infrastructure are paying for, which is a sort of a cornerstone of DCs. We also wouldn't have a citywide system focused to growth, so there'd be a lot of piecemeal work that would be going on, a lot of individual arrangements with developers that might not be advantageous in the public interest as well too. We'd run into situations where you'd have an inequitable access to infrastructure, so you could have a lot of leapfrogging that would be occurring and things like that as well. And then finally, we'd be missing a tool. DCs really do provide us a strong tool to fund our infrastructure to help facilitate development in an appropriate manner throughout the city. Any questions? Maybe I'll stop with that section then and take them here before I move into infrastructure planning.
We do. Okay, so are DCs only applied to new builds?
DCs are applied to new builds, and also we do potentially apply DCs in situations of conversions as well. So if you are enlarging an existing building, then you're paying DCs on that. That's for industrial, commercial, and institutional. But also if you're changing a use from an institutional, an industrial, or commercial use to a residential use, then you are paying a small amount extra in DCs. But if you're doing an industrial to a commercial conversion, then it's a one-to-one, and DCs aren't applied.
Okay. And then I think you kind of answered this, but so proportions / percentages could be rejigged. For example, could more funds be invested into transit and parks rather than roads? I think you're saying no, because they have to be in their buckets.
They have to be in their buckets, but over time, the city is continuously reviewing its service standards. And so if the service standards do change, then that can mean that we are collecting additional money to support those service standards as well too. So that's why it's really important to be involved in providing a strong community voice in the various master plan activities.
Yeah. So then Sandra follows up with this: bucket standards could be rejigged. And you're saying the bucket standards could be rejigged if the master plans change.
They can within their individual buckets, but for example, let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say going forward, council determined that they didn't want to provide funding for police in the future for whatever reason. We've been collecting money for police. That money would sit in a police development charge reserve fund and couldn't be used for other services. So it basically sits there until council decides they want to start collecting for police again, or another event that may occur in the future related to that. So yeah, they're very, as I said, regulated funds that are set up discrete from each other.
Great, thank you. And then Norman, I think, has a question, and then I've got 2 questions I'm saving to the very end.
So I'm not even sure if this is the right section to be asking this in, Paul, but I live in an older neighborhood. A lot of people do. So my question really is, do development charges, I mean, there obviously development charges are happening where it's coming from new development, but do older neighborhoods get any benefit from development charges?
So older neighborhoods do, in terms of if there's a fair bit of intensification that's occurring in the older neighborhoods and the existing services can't accommodate that growth, for example, then DCs are paying for the upgrades that are associated with that. One thing that we're doing with this DC study in particular and with the Parks Master Plan is taking a better look at what infrastructure is required for intensification areas as well too, to make sure that we're maintaining our service level throughout the older areas of the city as they're intensifying as well. But there's a lot of other things that are occurring that residents receive benefit from. So for example, I live in the north end of the city, and I've taken my son right now to the East Lines Community Center for swimming lessons. And so you're getting some benefit there. For example, roads that are changed, transit system that's improved as well. DCs are paying for those system-wide improvements and network improvements as well that help our city writ large.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so my final topic, and I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to keep you all, but I'm happy to continue the discussion as we go forward too. So I'm in your hands. But infrastructure planning is the sort of the next stage of what we do. Once we do our little high-level planning with our DC study, we do some annual monitoring of how the costs are, but then we get into what we call the growth management implementation strategy. And I'm going to speak to this, but I'm going to recognize that my colleagues in planning and economic development are the ones that run this every year. It's a really important process that we have to make sure that we're matching our assumptions of growth with what's proving out on the ground. So we have a number of what we call our GMIS areas. So these are our growth areas throughout the city. You can see them illustrated. They're mainly geographic areas. We also, of course, importantly, have the built area of the city as well, which is generally the area of intensification that we have too. And so there's projects that are associated with growth in all these areas. This is an example of what we look at through the GMIS. This is the southwest area of the city, and this is our growth and development map. So it's showing the various subdivisions that are coming forward, or lands that are to be developed in the future, and what we then identify as the various infrastructure projects that are required to support growth in that area. So this is over the next 15 years what we're going to be doing in the southwest area of the city. And so you're seeing a lot of work that has to occur to actually have this area move forward. And there's a considerable amount of investment that's been made over the past 5 years as well in the Southwest. I'm just using this as one example to actually have things move forward too. So what we had on the books as of last year was $21.4 million to spend for growth infrastructure in generally this area, the Southwest portion of the city. So maybe I'll scroll back and take all the areas off. This area is sort of coming online earlier on. We have 45.5 million for the next few years as well, sort of our interim investments, and then longer term, we're looking at making $29.4 million in the Southwest as well too. So that's for sanitary, for stormwater, for water, for some roads projects as well. So it's a fairly comprehensive amount of growth and infrastructure that's occurring. So through the GMIS process, we take that information and we're testing out with our stakeholders to determine, is that information still relevant based on the plans that people have for development in the city. From there, we do an annual update of our growth model. So we're actually looking at the development areas when they're anticipated to come online with the subdivisions that they're going to have. This is in the north area of the city. The number of units that are anticipated for that subdivision, and then when they're actually going to proceed. So we recognize that subdivisions won't necessarily build out in 1 year. They may take 3 to 5 potentially. A lot of that time is shortening up as demand's increasing as well too. So we use this information, this live build out model, we test with the development community to determine if we actually do need to make any adjustments to project timing to respond to growth needs as well. So that can help us determine if we need to push off some projects because they weren't required when we anticipated that they would be, or based on some other emergent need where we have to move infrastructure projects forward and whether or not it's appropriate to do that as well too. So it's something we do annually to keep things live. We also spend a lot of time looking at our reserve funds as well. So we do an analysis every year. We're doing it throughout the year, but primarily for GMIS, looking at what's the financial health of the reserve fund and whether it can accommodate any different changes from the adopted DC plan that we have. The one that we're really of interest right now is the Sanitary Reserve Fund. And so over the past 5 years, we've had a huge amount of investment in sanitary infrastructure throughout the city in a number of geographic areas. And what you're seeing with this graph, which we try to illustrate, are the bars represent the capital budget debt payments. So how much debt we have to pay every year for the infrastructure that we have taken on or are anticipating to take on going forward. So you can see that we're in 2021, we're looking at around $6 million. That's going up by 2028 to almost $10 million of debt every year. And then it does sort of come down a little bit with that. But importantly, we're then measuring that against how much money we are bringing in to actually pay for the investments in infrastructure, both in terms of cash and also making our debt payment as well too. So the red line you're seeing here is a 1-to-1 ratio. So this would be bringing in $1 of revenue for $1 of debt payment. We obviously never want to dip below that, because then we've got a situation where we're essentially using our credit card to pay our mortgage, which is something we never want to do. So ideally, we're trying to move to a greater level of sustainability over time. So that's an important part of the financial picture that we do. And then finally, through GMIS, once we've made a determination of our projects, we move into the phase of implementation. That's when we're adjusting through with recommendations to council, any project timing that might be warranted. We then move forward with tendering the various infrastructure components. So that's the design work that has to be required to determine the actual needs and what it's going to look like. And then the construction of the infrastructure that is required as well. We move into a phase then where the projects are built and they're made operational, which can last a couple of years depending on the project as well. And then at that point, development can access the municipal services from their local services that we will eventually be assuming in the future too. So that then brings us back to looking at the next DEC study. So we do our annual updates and we reflect any changes in the next DEC study, which then rolls us back once it's approved to the annual process or the regular process that we have with our cycle that we go through. So just in summary for today, so I think you can probably appreciate London is a growing community. It's growing actually faster than we anticipated, and we're very interested to see how that might be changing, as well as some trends that we're seeing as well too. We're also seeing, of course, changes in our housing structure as well, which is very supportive of our official plan policies moving forward. We do try to always match our growth funding with who benefits as well in the city. And so that's a corner part of DC's. And then finally, infrastructure is being installed as it's needed and based on affordability as well. So we're making sure that the DC rates are as affordable to DC ratepayers as they can be, but they are also making sure that they're paying for the costs that are required to support growth in our city. So with that, Skylar, that's my presentation. I'll turn things back to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have that are more global as well.
Thank you very much, Paul. I always learn something new. One facetious question I want to ask is, does your brain explode on a regular basis trying to remember all the projects and like this reserve fund here and this thing over here?
It is it doesn't explode, but it can be challenging. That's why I've got a really good team that I work with as well. So our division manager is Jason Siness, and you may have worked with Jason in the past. He's been involved in the city's budget for a number of years. I also have Greg LaForge and Adam Langmuir who are on my team as well too, that do a lot of the important day-to-day work as well with this. But I will say the DC study in general has hundreds of assumptions that are involved in it, that it can be a lot to sort of keep things in line, which is really important. A reason why we do all the monitoring work that we do, and making sure that we're trying to say, is everything proving out based on what we anticipated in the study, and then do we need to make any changes and make any recommendations to council?
Yes, well, kudos to you guys.
Thanks.
It's a handful, even just like learning about it. I'm like, oh my God, there's be so many things to keep track of, and good on you for managing it all.
Well, we're very fortunate that council actually has prioritized it with a full-time team as well to do this work. So I'm very fortunate for that.
Nice. Okay. We do have some more questions. So I'm wondering, do you mind stop sharing your slide or your screen for now? Yep. And then I think we're good. Actually, Indira, if you want to stop recording, then we can just have a bit more of a discussion-based question and answer period. And just maybe then really quickly, thank you for everyone that's viewing this after the fact, and appreciate your time. Yes, thank you, everybody.